Carlos Castaneda's A Separate Reality, Part 1, The Preliminaries of Seeing, Chapter 5. I returned to Don Juan's house on October 3rd, 1968, for the sole purpose of asking him about the events surrounding Eligio's initiation. An almost endless stream of questions had occurred to me while rereading the account of what took place then. I was after very precise explanations, so I made a list of questions beforehand, carefully choosing the most appropriate words. I began by asking him, "Did I see that night, Don Juan?" "I almost did." "You almost did," he said. "Did you see what I was seeing?" Let me get this one. "Did you see that I was seeing Eligio's movements?" "Yes, I saw that Mescalito was allowing you to see part of Eligio's lesson. Otherwise, you would have been looking at a man sitting there, or perhaps lying there. During the last mitote, you did not notice that the men were doing anything, did you?" At the last mitote, I had not noticed anything of the men performing movements out of the ordinary. I told them I could safely say that all I had recorded in my notes was that some of them got up and went to the bushes more often than the others. "But you nearly saw Eligio's entire lesson," Don Juan went on. "Think about that. Do you understand now how generous Mescalito is with you? Mescalito has never been so gentle with anyone, to my knowledge, not anyone, and yet you have no regard for his generosity. How can you turn your back on him so bluntly? Perhaps I should say, in exchange for what you are turning your back on, why are you turning your back on Mescalito?" I felt that Don Juan was cornering me again. I was unable to answer his question. I had always believed that I had to quit the apprenticeship in order to save myself, yet I had no idea from what I was saving myself, or for what. I wanted to change the direction of our conversation quickly, and so to that end I abandoned my intention to carry on with all my pre-calculated questions and brought out my most important query. "I wonder if you could tell me more about your controlled folly," I said. "What do you want to know about it? Please tell me, Don Juan, what exactly is controlled folly?" Don Juan laughed loudly and made a smacking sound by slapping his thigh with the hollow of his hands. "This is controlled folly," he said, and laughed and slapped his thigh again. "What do you mean?" "I am happy that you finally asked me about controlled folly after so many years. Yet it wouldn't have mattered to me in the least if you had never asked. Yet I have chosen to feel happy, as if I cared, that you asked, as if it mattered that I care. That is controlled folly." We both laughed very loudly. I hugged him. I found his explanation delightful, although I did not quite understand it. We were sitting as usual in the area right in front of the door of his house. It was mid-morning. Don Juan had a pile of seeds in front of him and was picking the debris from them. I had offered to help him, but he had turned me down, and he said the seeds were a gift from one of his friends in central Mexico, and I did not have enough power to touch them. "With whom do you exercise control folly, Don Juan?" I asked after a long silence. He chuckled. "With everybody," he exclaimed, smiling. "When do you choose to exercise it then?" "Every single time I act." I felt I needed to recapitulate at that point, and I asked him if control folly meant that his acts were never sincere, but were only acts of an actor. "My acts are sincere," he said, "but they are only the acts of an actor." "Then everything you do must be controlled folly," I said, truly surprised. "Yes, everything," he said. "But it can't be true," I protested, "that every one of your acts is only controlled folly." "Why not?" he replied with a mysterious look. "That would mean that nothing matters to you, and you really don't care about anything or anybody. Take me, for example. Do you mean that you don't care whether or not I become a man of knowledge, or whether I live or die or do anything? True, I don't. You are like Lucio, or everybody else in my life, my controlled folly. I experienced a peculiar feeling of emptiness. Obviously, there was no reason in the world why Don Juan had to care about me. But on the other hand, I had almost the certainty that he cared about me personally. I thought it could not be otherwise, since he had always given me his undivided attention during every moment I had spent with him. It occurred to me that perhaps Don Juan was just saying that because he was annoyed with me. After all, I had quit his teachings. I have the feeling that they are not talking about the same thing, I said. I shouldn't have used myself as an example. What I meant to say was that there must be something in the world that you care about in a way that is not controlled folly. I don't think it is possible to go on living if nothing really matters to us. That applies to you, he said. Things matter to you. You asked me about controlled folly, and I told you that everything I do in regard to myself and my fellow men is folly, because nothing matters. My point is, Don Juan, that if nothing matters to you, how can you go on living? He laughed, and after a moment's pause, in which he seemed to deliberate whether or not to answer, he got up and went back to his house, and I followed him. Wait, Don Juan, I said. I really want to know. You must explain to me what you mean. Perhaps it's not possible to explain, he said. Certain things in your life matter to you because they're important. Your acts are certainly important to you, but for me, not a single thing is important any longer, neither my acts nor the acts of any of my fellow men. I could go on living, though. I go on living, though, because I have my will, because I have tempered my will throughout my life until it's neat and wholesome, and now it doesn't matter to me that nothing matters. My will controls the folly of my life. He squatted and ran his fingers on some herbs that he had put to dry in the sun on a big piece of burlap. I was bewildered. Never would I have anticipated the direction that my query had taken. After a long pause, I thought of a good point. I told him that in my opinion, some of the acts of my fellow men were of supreme importance. I pointed out that a nuclear war was definitely the most dramatic example of such an act. I said that for me, destroying life on the face of the earth was an act of staggering enormity. You believe that because you're thinking. You're thinking about life, Don Juan said with a glint in his eyes. You're not seeing. Would I feel differently if I could see, I asked. Once a man learns to see, he finds himself alone in the world, with nothing but folly, Don Juan said cryptically. He paused for a moment, and then he looked at me as if he wanted to judge the effects of his words. Your acts, as well as the acts of your fellow men in general, appear to be important to you, because you have learned to think that they are important. He used the word learned with such a peculiar inflection that it forced me to ask what he meant by it. He stopped handling his plants and he looked at me. We learn to think about everything, he said, and then we train our eyes to look as we think about things we look at. We look at ourselves already thinking that we are important, and therefore we've got to feel important. But then, when a man learns to see, he realizes that he can no longer think about the things he looks at. And if he cannot think about what he looks at, everything becomes unimportant. Don Juan must have noticed my puzzled look and repeated his statements 3 times, as if to make me understand them. What he had said sounded to me like gibberish at first, but upon thinking about it, his words loomed more like a sophisticated statement about some facet of perception. I tried to think of a good question that would make him clarify his point, but I could not think of anything. All of a sudden I felt exhausted and could not formulate my thoughts clearly. Don Juan seemed to notice my fatigue and patted me gently. Clean these plants here, he said. Then shred them carefully into this jar. He handed me a large coffee jar and left. He returned to his house an hour later. In the late afternoon, I had finished shredding his plants and had had plenty of time to write my notes. I wanted to ask him some questions right off, but he was not in any mood to answer me. He said that he was finished and had to fix his food first. He lit a fire in his earthen stove and set up a pot with bone broth stock. He looked at the bag of groceries I had brought and took some vegetables, sliced them into small pieces, and dumped them into the pot. Then he lay on his mat, kicked off his sandals, and told me to sit closer to the stove so I could feel the fire. It was almost dark. From where I sat, I could see the sky to the west. The edges of the thick cloud formation were tinted with deep buff, while the center of the clouds remained almost black. I was going to make a comment on how beautiful the clouds were when he spoke first. Fluffy edges and a thick core, he said, pointing at the clouds. His statement was perfectly apropos, that it made me jump. I was just going to tell you about the clouds, I said. Then I beat you to it, he said, and laughed with a childlike abandon. I asked him if he was in a mood to answer some questions. What do you want me to know, he replied. What you told me this afternoon about controlled folly has disturbed me very much, I said. I really cannot understand what you meant. Of course you cannot understand, he said. You are trying to think about it, and what I said does not fit with your thoughts. I'm trying to think about it, I said, because that's the only way I personally can understand anything. For example, Don Juan, do you mean that once a man learns to see, everything in the world is worthless? Excuse me. I didn't say worthless. I said unimportant. Everything is equal and therefore unimportant. For example, there is no way for me to say that my acts are more important than yours, or that one thing is more essential than another. Therefore, all things are equal, and by being equal, they are unimportant. I asked him if his statements were a pronouncement that what he had called seeing was in effect a better way than merely looking at things. He said that the eyes of man could perform both functions, but neither of them were better than the other. However, to train the eyes only to look was, in his opinion, an unnecessary loss. For instance, we need to look with our eyes to laugh, he said, because only when we look at things can we catch the funny edge of the world. On the other hand, when our eyes see, everything is so equal that nothing is funny. Do you mean, Don Juan, that a man who sees cannot ever laugh? He remained silent for some time. Perhaps there are men of knowledge who never laugh, he said. I don't know any of them, though. Those I know see and also look, so they laugh. Would a man of knowledge cry as well? I suppose so. Our eyes look so we may laugh or cry or rejoice or be sad or be happy. I personally don't like to be sad, so whenever I witness something that would ordinarily make me sad, I simply shift my eyes and see it, instead of looking at it. And when I encounter something funny, I look and I laugh. But then, Don Juan, your laughter is real and not controlled folly. Don Juan stared at me for a moment. I talk to you because you make me laugh, he said. You remind me of some bushy-tailed rats of the desert that get caught when they stick their tails in holes trying to scare other rats away in order to steal their food. You get caught in your own questions. Watch out. Sometimes those rats yank their tails off trying to pull themselves free. I found his comparison funny and I laughed. Don Juan had once showed me some small rodents with bushy tails that looked like fat squirrels. The image of one of those chubby rats yanking its tail off was sad and at the same time morbidly funny. My laughter, as well as everything I do, is real, he said. But it also is controlled folly because it is useless. It changes nothing, and yet I still do it. But as I understand it, Don Juan, your laughter is not useless. It makes you happy. No, I am happy because I choose to look at things that make me happy, and then my eyes catch their funny edge, and I laugh. I have said this to you countless times. One must always choose the path with heart in order to be at one's best. Perhaps one can always laugh. I interpreted what he had said as meaning that crying was inferior to laughter, or at least perhaps an act that weakened us. He asserted that there were no intrinsic difference and that both were unimportant. He said, however, that his preference was for laughter, because laughter made his body feel better than crying. At that point, I suggested that if one has a preference, there is no equality. If he preferred laughing to crying, the former was indeed more important. He stubbornly maintained that his preference did not mean they were not equal, and I insisted that our argument could only be logically stretched to saying that if things were supposed to be so equal, why not also choose death? Many men of knowledge do that, he said. One day they may simply disappear. People may think that they have been ambushed or killed because of their doings. They choose to die because it doesn't matter to them. On the other hand, I choose to live and to laugh, not because it matters, but because that choice is the bent of my nature. The reason I say I choose is because I see, but it isn't that I choose to live. My will makes me go on living in spite of anything I might see. You don't understand me now because your habit of thinking as you look and thinking as you think. This statement intrigued me very much. I asked him to explain what he meant by it. He repeated the same construct various times, as if giving himself time to arrange it in different terms. And then he delivered his point, saying that by thinking, he meant the constant idea that we have of everything in the world. He said that seeing dispelled that habit, and until I learned to see, I could not really understand what he meant. But if nothing matters, Don Juan, why should it matter that I learn to see? I told you once that our lot as men is to learn, for good or bad, he said. I have learned to see, and I tell you that nothing really matters. Now it's your turn. Perhaps someday you will see, and you will know then whether things matter or not. For me, nothing matters, but perhaps for you, everything will. You should know by now that a man of knowledge lives by acting, not by thinking about acting, nor by thinking about what he will think when he has finished acting. A man of knowledge chooses a path with heart and follows it. And then he looks and rejoices and laughs. And then he sees and knows. He knows that his life will be over altogether too soon. And he knows that he, as well as everybody else, is not going anywhere. He knows because he sees that nothing is more important than anything else. In other words, a man of knowledge has no honor, no dignity, no family, no name, no country, but only life to be lived. And under these circumstances, his only tie to his fellow men is his controlled folly. Thus a man of knowledge endeavors and sweats and puffs, and if one looks at him, he is just like any ordinary man, except that the folly of his life is under control, nothing being more important than anything else. A man of knowledge chooses any act and acts it out as if it matters to him. His controlled folly makes him say that what he does matters and makes him act as if it did. And yet he knows that it doesn't. So when he fulfills his acts, he retreats in peace. And whether his acts were good or bad or worked or didn't is in no way part of his concern. A man of knowledge may choose, on the other hand, to remain totally impassive and never act, and behave as if to be impassive really matters to him. he will be rightfully true to that too, because that would also be his controlled folly. I involved myself at this point in a very complicated effort to explain to Don Juan that I was interested in knowing what would motivate a man of knowledge to act in a particular way in spite of the fact that he knew nothing mattered. He chuckled softly before answering. "You think about your acts," he said. "Therefore, you have to believe that your acts are as important as you think they are. When in reality, nothing of what one does is important. Nothing. But then, if nothing really matters, as you ask me, how can I go on living? It would be simple to die. That's what you say and believe, because you're thinking about life, just as you're thinking now what seeing would be like. You wanted me to describe it to you so you could begin to think about it, the way you do with everything else. In the case of seeing, however, thinking is not the issue at all. So I cannot tell you what it is like to see. Now you want me to describe the reasons for my controlled folly, and I can only tell you that controlled folly is very much like seeing. It is something you cannot think about." He yawned. He lay on his back and stretched his arms and legs, and his bones made a cracking sound. "You've been away too long," he said. "You think too much." He got up and walked into the thick chaparral at the side of the house. I fed the fire to keep the pot boiling. I was going to light a kerosene lantern, but the semi-darkness was very soothing. The fire from the stove, which supplied enough light to write, also created a reddish glow around me. I put my notes on the ground and lay down. I felt tired. Out of the whole conversation with Don Juan, the only poignant thing in my mind was that he did not care about me. It disturbed me immensely. Over a period of years, I had put my trust in him. Had I not had complete confidence in him, I would have been paralyzed with fear at the prospect of learning his knowledge. The premise on which I had based my trust was the idea that he cared about me personally. Actually, I had always been afraid of him, but I had kept my fear in check because I trusted him. When he removed that basis, I had nothing to fall back on. I felt helpless. A very strange anxiety possessed me. I became extremely agitated and began pacing up and down in front of the stove. Don Juan was taking a long time. I waited for him impatiently. He returned a while later. He sat down again in front of the fire, and I blurted out my fears. I told him that I worried because I was incapable of changing directions in midstream. I explained to him that, together with the trust I had in him, I had also learned to respect and to regard his way of life as being intrinsically more rational, or at least more functional than mine. I said that his words had plunged me into a terrible conflict, because they entailed me having to change my feelings. To illustrate my point, I told Don Juan the story of an old man of my culture, a very wealthy conservative lawyer who lived his life convinced that he upheld the truth. In the early 30s, with the advent of the New Deal, he found himself passionately involved in the political drama of that time. He was categorically sure that change was deleterious to the country, and out of devotion to his way of life and conviction that he was right, he vowed to fight for what he thought would be a political evil. But the tide of time was too strong, and it overpowered him. He struggled for 10 years against it, in the political arena and in the realm of his personal life. Then the Second World War sealed his efforts into total defeat. His political and ideological downfall resulted in profound bitterness. He became a self-exile for 25 years. When I met him, he was 84 years old and had come back to his hometown to spend his last years at a home for the aged. It seemed inconceivable to me that he had lived that long, considering the way he had squandered his life in bitterness and self-pity. Somehow he found my company amenable, and we used to talk at great length. The last time I saw him, he had concluded our conversation with the following: I have had time to turn around and examine my life. The issues of my time are today only a story, not even an interesting one. Perhaps I threw away years of my life chasing something that never existed. I had the feeling lately that I believed in something farcical. It wasn't worth my while. I think I know that. However, I can't retrieve the 40 years I've lost. I told Don Juan that my conflict arose from the doubts into which his words about controlled folly had thrown me. If nothing really matters, I said, upon becoming a man of knowledge, one would find oneself perforce as empty as my friend and in no better position. That's not so, Don Juan said cuttingly. Your friend is lonely only because he will die without seeing. In his life, he just grew old, and now he must have more self-pity than ever before. He feels he threw away 40 years because he was after victories and found only defeats. Yet he never he'll never know that to be victorious and to be defeated are equal. So now you're afraid of me because I've told you that you're equal to everything else. You're being childish. Our lot as men is to learn, and one goes to knowledge as one goes to war. I have told you this countless times. One goes to knowledge or to war with fear, with respect, aware that one is going to war, and with absolute confidence in oneself. But put your trust in yourself, not in me. And so you're afraid of the emptiness of your friend's life? But there's no emptiness in the life of a man of knowledge, I tell you. Everything is filled to the brim. Don Juan stood up and extended his arms as if feeling things in the air. Everything is filled to the brim, he repeated, and everything is equal. I'm not like your friend who just grew old. When I tell you that nothing matters, I don't mean the way he does. For him, his struggle was not worth his while because he was defeated. For me, there is no victory or defeat or emptiness. Everything is filled to the brim, and everything is equal, and my struggle was worth my while. In order to become a man of knowledge, one must be a warrior, not a whimpering child. One must strive without giving up, without a complaint, without flinching, until one sees, only to realize that nothing matters. Don Juan stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. The food was ready. He took the pot off the fire and placed it on the adobe rectangular block which he had built against the wall, which he used as a shelf or a table. With his foot he shoved two small boxes that served as comfortable chairs, especially one if one sat with his back against the supporting beams of the wall. He signaled me to sit down, and then he poured a bowl of soup. He smiled. His eyes were shining as if he were truly enjoying my presence. He pushed the bowl gently towards me. There was such a warmth and kindness in his gesture that it seemed to be an appeal to restore my trust in him. I felt idiotic. I tried to disrupt my mood by looking for my spoon, but I couldn't find it. The soup was too hot to be drunk directly from the bowl, and while it cooled off, I asked Don Juan if controlled folly meant that a man of knowledge could not like anybody anymore. He stopped eating and laughed. You're too concerned with liking people or being liked yourself. Hello, Facebook. A man of knowledge likes, and that's all. He likes whatever or whomever he wants, but he uses his controlled folly to be unconcerned about it. The opposite of what you are doing now. To like people or not to be liked by people is not all one can do as a man. He stared at me for a moment with his head tilted a little to one side. Think about that, he said. There is one more thing I want to ask you, Don Juan. You said that we need to look with our eyes to laugh, but I believe we laugh because we think. Take a blind man. He also laughs. No, he said, blind men don't laugh. Their bodies jerk a little and with a ripple of laughter, but they never looked at the funny edge of the world and have to imagine it. Their laughter is not roaring. He did not speak anymore. I had the sensation of well-being, of happiness. We ate in silence. Then Don Juan began to laugh. I was using a dry twig to spoon the vegetables into my mouth. October 4th, 1968. At a certain moment today, I asked Don Juan if he minded talking a bit more about seeing. He seemed to deliberate for an instant, and then he smiled and said that I was again involved in my usual routine, trying to talk instead of doing. If you want to see, you have to let the smoke guide you, he said emphatically. I won't talk about this anymore. I was helping him clean some dry herbs. We worked in complete silence for a long time. When I am forced into a prolonged silence, I always feel apprehensive, especially around Don Juan. At any given moment, I brought up a question to him as a sort of compulsive, almost belligerent outburst. How does a man of knowledge exercise controlled folly when it comes to the death of a person he loves? I asked. Don Juan was taken aback at my question and looked at me quizzically. Take your grandson Lucio, I said. Would your acts be controlled folly at the time of his death? Take my son Eulalio, Eulalio, I'm going to say Eulalio. That's a better example, Don Juan said calmly. He was crushed by rocks while working in the construction of the Pan American Highway. My acts toward him at that moment of his death were controlled folly. When I came down to the blasting area, he was almost dead, but his body was so strong that it kept on moving and kicking. I stood in front of him and told the boys in the road crew not to move him anymore. They obeyed me and stood there surrounding my son. Looking at his mangled body, I stood there too. But I did not look. I shifted my eyes so I would see his personal life disintegrating, expanding uncontrollably beyond its limits, like a fog of crystals, because that is the way life and death mix and expand. This is what I did at the time of my son's death. That's all one could ever do, and that is controlled folly. Had I looked at him, I would have watched him becoming immobile, and I would have felt a cry inside of me, because never again would I look at his fine figure pacing the earth. I saw his death instead, and there was no sadness, no feeling. His death was equal to everything else. Don Juan was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be sad, but then he smiled and tapped my head. So you may say that when it comes to death of a person I love, my controlled folly is to shift my eyes. I thought about the people I love myself, and a terribly oppressive wave of self-pity enveloped me. Lucky you, Don Juan, I said. You can shift your eyes while I can only look. He found my statement funny and laughed. Lucky bull, he said. It's hard work. We both laughed. After a long silence, I began probing him again, perhaps only to dispel my own sadness. If I have understood you correctly then, Don Juan, I said, the only acts in life of a man of knowledge which are not controlled folly are those he performs with his ally or with Mescalito. Is that right? That's right, he said, chuckling. My ally and Mescalito are not on a par with us human beings. My controlled folly applies only to myself and to the acts I perform while in the company of my fellow men. However, it is a logical possibility, I said, to think that a man of knowledge may also regard his acts with his ally or with Mescalito as controlled folly. True? He stared at me for a moment. You're thinking again, he said. A man of knowledge doesn't think. Therefore, he cannot encounter that possibility. Take me, for example. I say that my controlled folly applies to the acts I performed while in the company of my fellow men. I say that because I can see my fellow men. However, I cannot see through my ally, and that makes it incomprehensible to me. So how could I use control folly if I don't see through it? With my ally or with Mescalito, I'm only a man who knows how to see and finds that he's baffled by what he sees. A man who knows that he'll never understand all that is around him. Take your case, for instance. It doesn't matter to me whether you become a man of knowledge or not. However, it matters to Mescalito. Obviously, it matters to him, or he wouldn't take so many steps to show his concern about you. Monk, stop it. To show his concern about you. I can notice his concern, and I act toward it. Yet his reasons are incomprehensible to me. End of chapter. Sorry, Monk.